anticipate will be an insightful and engaging evening exploring the rich cultural landscapes both in Mumbai and Madras. My name is Jagru Panda. I'm the Gallery Director of DAG's Mumbai chapter. Established in 1993, DAG has over the past 25 years built a reputation for the quality of its collection that represents the expanse of the Indian art practice. The extensive collection charts a historic continuum from the early works of academic trained artists in Bengal and Bombay to modernists from Baroda, Delhi and Madras. With the aim of taking Indian modernism to a wider audience, DAG now has gallery spaces here in the historic Kamalika district in Mumbai, the iconic Fuller building in Manhattan, New York, and in addition, all this in addition to its gallery in New Delhi, which was the genesis of DAG. The mandate of taking art to the people has led to museum-quality exhibition collaborations with stellar art institutions. The most recent of these is India's first public-private collaboration in the art space that began earlier this year in January 2019 with Prime Minister Narendra Modi inaugurating Drishakala Art Museum in the precincts of Red Fort, New Delhi, a UNESCO World Heritage Site in which the Archaeological Survey of India has partnered with DAG. With the democratization of Indian art at its core, DAG consistently hosts outreach programs for a diverse spectrum of society. Tonight's event will explore the synergies between Madras and Mumbai through the framework of DAG's current exhibition you'll see here, Madras Modern. Through this survey exhibition, curator Dr. Shrafi Bhagat, who you will hear lots from later, maps the trajectory of the Madras art movement spanning from the late 50s through the 80s. The evening's event opens up a dialogue beyond visual art to further encompass dance, architecture, and regional cuisine. After the symposium and some refreshments, there will be the rare opportunity for a guided walkthrough of the exhibition with the curator herself, who is with us for one evening only from Chennai, so I urge you all to make the most of it. I hope you will all enjoy this evening and leave with many new perspectives, as I'm sure I will. I will hand you over to Asad Lalji, who has orchestrated tonight's fantastic evening. Thank you so much all for coming.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. You'll all know my name right now. So I wear a couple of hats, but right now I run something called Avid Learning. Many of you all are regulars out there. Avid is a public programming platform and the cultural arm of the SR Group. We actually have conducted over 1,100 programs across multiple formats like workshops, panel discussions, festivals, seminars, and connected with over 130,000 individuals since our inception in 2009. In fact, this year we complete 10 years of programming in Mumbai. We focus on art, applied visual and performing arts, literature, culture and heritage, and innovation. Our curatorial focus includes presenting targeted discussions, such as this one, and symposiums, workshops, roundtables, festivals, and much more. Our vision is to invite more people into the conversation about the arts and culture by deepening their multicultural learning experiences through sustained partnerships and by diversifying our programs with new spaces, formats, and approaches. Tonight's discussion will explore the history and the evolution of the vibrant arts and culture milieu in Bombay and Madras, two of India's most iconic and historic cities, by examining their artistic, architectural, and culinary lineages. So without further ado, welcome to Madras, Mumbai, Musings on the Modern City, presented by DAG and Avid Learning. I'd like to now introduce our speakers for the evening, and as I call your names, I'm going to urge you to come by and try and sit on the bar stools. The curator for the show, art historian, critic, and independent curator, Dr. Ashrafi Bhagat. Bharatanatyam Dancer Namita Bodaji. architect and urban conservationist Kamalika Bose, chef and food entrepreneur Siddharth Somaiya, and our moderator for the evening, who needs no introduction, but I'm going to introduce him, curator, poet, and cultural theorist Ranjit Hoskote. For more about our esteemed panelists, please refer to the bio handouts that you have been given. Please remember, take out your phones, everybody, put them on silent and start using them. Get social, start posting, reposting, and tagging. Our handle is @avidlearning and hashtag is learning never stops. Thank you very much, and over to you, Ranjit. Look forward to an exciting discussion.
Thank you so much, Jagarup and Asad, for your framing remarks. And thank you all for coming out this evening for a discussion where we hope to draw out both the affinities and all that which is distinctive about these two great cities. And it's a special pleasure to be able to do this in the context of an exhibition that Ashrafi, who is a colleague of long standing, has curated, Madras Modern. And I say this with a particular awareness of how our narrative about post-colonial, or if you will, modern Indian art, has been dominated by things that happened in Bombay, in Shantiniketan, in Baroda, and in Delhi. And to a considerable extent, there has not been an awareness of the many experiments in the arts, in the visual arts that took place in Madras. I'm thinking particularly of a book and a project that most people have forgotten. I'm thinking here of Joseph James, who in 1993 published a book called The Madras Metaphor, with a marvelous preface by Al-Qazi. And I would see this exhibition as being in that genealogy of drawing attention to the works of marvelous artists, such as the ones indeed who surround us as we sit here. People whose contribution has sometimes been embalmed in notions of tradition versus modernity. And I'm hoping that we'll, as we go along, unpack and render somewhat more complex this rather simple and simple-minded binary. And those of you who've already seen this exhibition will know that these are themes that resonate through the exhibition with a very firm gaze on the actual practice of the artists. And also I'm very happy to have this distinguished panel who work in different parts of the larger sphere of the arts, the culinary arts, the visual arts, architecture, and dance. And I will make brief framing remarks about the two cities before we plunge into the discussion and I draw you out. I mean, we all tend to think about Bombay and Madras as essentially colonial cities, and they were, to a considerable extent, cities that evolved out of the colonial encounter. They emerged as garrison cities. Each had a fort, as you know. But there was also this very peculiar binary between, in each place, the white town and the black town, as these sites were actually known for a long time. But what we sometimes overlook is the other and larger history in which you could situate these two cities. And I remember from admittedly parachute visits to Madras in the early 2000s, a very strong sense that you were literally in another country. Because Bombay tends to face outwards, westwards, northwards. When you're in Madras, you have a very strong sense of a location in the peninsula, and through the Tamil diaspora, a connection with Sri Lanka, Malaysia, and Southeast Asia. There are in both these cities very, very distinctive sensibilities, different sets of reference. And when one city addresses another, I think what is called for is a very sensitive process of translation, because the assumptions are not entirely the same. And there also are very different histories of modernism, because we sometimes tend to think that modernism was some universally executable program that fell from heaven, or from New York, or from London, or Paris. The truth, as we all know as practitioners, is that modernism was modulated under very different circumstances, depending on which location you were in. the key questions of modernism for artists like K.C.S. Panikkar and his circle in Cholamandal were not the same as those for Sousa, Mohan Samant, Hussain, and others in Bombay. And I hope we'll address these questions as we go along. I'd also, and this is something that I hope will inform our discussion, we also ought to see these two presidency cities as part of a larger network of such cities. So inevitably, when you think of one city, you also think of what comes to it from elsewhere. From, for instance, Madras. I'm very happy to see the work of Professor Roy Chaudhary here. The fact is that there is a tradition that goes back to Havel, to Roy Chaudhary. There's a very strong connection with Calcutta and the Bengal Renaissance in Madras. You know, so and as far as Bombay is concerned, it also draws on other kinds of relatively invisible hinterlands. So I do hope that we're going to be drawing some of these questions out as we go along. So I'm going to really begin somewhat counterintuitively maybe, but Kamalika, I'm going to start with you. Could I draw you out on precisely this question? I mean, your experience has embraced a number of these cities that were crucibles of modernity, whether it was Calcutta, Bombay, or Ahmedabad. So could I draw you out on the specific trajectories of the modern in each of these places? Do you see it as a singular kind of process, or was it uneven? What is it that makes this journey into the modern distinctive for different Indian cities?
Sure. So I think my experience in studying various cities, precisely the ones that you have mentioned, makes me understand that the modern project was not universally adopted or accepted or executed in all cities, and even because of the patronage that it found. For example, in some cities it was a state project, versus in some cities like Ahmedabad, it was entirely owned by the mercantile elite of the city. So even the nature of patronage that was seeing you through a transition from the colonial into the modern was really informing the aesthetic as well as the nature of projects that modernism gave us in these cities. So for example, in something like Calcutta, we see a lot of institutional architecture coming in, because the capital had shifted to Delhi and we were kind of heading towards independence, and the new sort of commercial India that was emerging was what was adopting the modern idiom. But if we look at Ahmedabad, for example, and then I'll come to Bombay, it was more of the patronage lay in the arts, in education, so the new sort of the IIMs and the science research centers, and that's where architects like the first generation Indian architects like Kanvinde was also practicing, and Vikram Sarabhai being there, and there was that sort of awakening. But if we come back to Bombay, again, I think Bombay, the kind of architecture we see has really emerged through its specific patrons, who were really the Jewish and the Parsis, and because of that, we see modernism being embraced in a very different way. And so I think if it's about modernism in architecture that you're talking about.
Thank you, Kamalika. Could I carry these thoughts with me now to you, Ashrafi? Could I draw you out on the kind of support that K.C.S. Panikkar and his circle would have had when they began as artists in Madras? What was the sort of atmosphere? Because it's a city that, in one sense, is strongly invested in classical forms of culture. Music and dance is particularly what I'm thinking of. What was it like to stake out a new territory of the modern for artists like Panikkar and many of the other figures we see around?
Comparatively, when you have to see Madras with Bombay or Calcutta or even Baroda, I would say that Madras had a very difficult time. And the city was actually in the stranglehold, sorry to use that word, but it was in the stranglehold of Music Academy. And that is, performances in dance and music alone. So much so that visual arts, which was so dynamically being practiced from the locus of the Madras College of Arts and Crafts, was not at all appreciated. They didn't know how to look at it, they didn't know how to see it, they didn't know how to understand. So Panika, when he began working on his celebrated words and symbols series, you can see one of those works there, which is a very beautiful work. And that work, which has a lot of regional characteristics. Now, for him to move away from what D.P. Roy Choudhury in his pedagogy was propagating. D.P. had come from Calcutta. He was a student of Abanindranath Tagore, a rebel student of Abanindranath Tagore. And when he got an opportunity, he applied for the principal job. He had a tough competition, of course, but he had also support in Lady Pentland and many other connoisseurs and collectors of Madras. So that's how he landed up with the job. Now, DP's role is very important if Panika's role has to be defined also, because, you know, it's a correspondence of the roles and the seminality which these two artists brought to fine arts program. Till 1930, there was no fine arts in the College of Arts and Crafts. DP came in and he structured the program into painting and sculpture, which was a 5-year diploma course. And 1934 marks a watershed year in the history of the institution, because that's when the first crop of students passed out. Till then, no students had graduated. You know why? Because they were all craftsmen children. They were given stipends and they would be in the institution for 10 years. So he brought in a structure, a system. Now, Panika was a student of D.P. Roy Choudhury. And Panika had introduced what I call it as a perceptual empirical approach. What you see, you render. And that's how the program was structured. In the mornings, in the studios, in the afternoons, go out into the city and look at it and then come back and do your work, watercolors, painting. He introduced all of these mediums. And he believed that skill is something which can be taught, but creativity is something which has to come from an individual. And he stuck to this very romantic notion. Panika was a student, as I told you. So when he came on the scene, when he became a teacher at the institution in 1941, he went through the pedagogy which was established by D.P. Roy Choudhury, but it came to a point when he felt that there was, you know, the pedagogy was reaching a moribund state. Students were only acquiring skills and they were only rendering things in a very realistic manner, which was almost akin to the academic naturalism that was being propagated in all the other colonial institutions like in Bombay or Calcutta. So he says unless something else has to be brought in, that is what will change the attitude of the students, what will instigate the students to think in a different manner. And he says that modern European artists and their works should be brought to the knowledge of the students. DP did not want that. There was a tussle between the two, but he finally brought it in. And there are many artists, when I spoke to them when I was doing my research, they all mentioned this aspect of Panika, that he would come quietly looking at the works, nudge them, instigate them, tell them you can do a line this way, a head this way, or a hand that way. And he says that way we were set free. And we were also shown books by various masters, from the Impressionists to the Post-Impressionists, Cubists, Abstractionists, and we got our ideas. That was not enough. Panika also edged them on to, technically explore, use different kind of materials like paper, board, aluminum sheets, and also various mediums. All of this actually was quite a task for Panika. But what made him successful was that he himself experimented. And the philosophy of the school was that when a teacher paints, you are free to come and see them at work, which was not there with D.P. Roy Choudhury. D.P. had a very aristocratic persona, and he would work in his studio. Then there would be a few students who would be helping him out. And if you are invited, then you stand there and watch. Otherwise, you stand outside and you watch him work. So this is one of the factors, which is, I would say, which I have studied, and it has also been reinforced by another author, that there was a tendency to idealize somebody who was, had this aristocratic persona or somebody who was more creative. And that's an attitude which still prevails. And we see it in the films and we see it in the politics also. So that is how DP was idealized and then Panikkar was equally idealized. Panikkar was shrewd, crafty, intellectual. And he knew how to moderate and modulate his students. So when he went to London for his exhibition in 1954, and there he got a critical remark that his works are in the best tradition of European masters like a Impressionist or a Post-Impressionist. There's one work here which looks exactly like Cézanne. He says, where is the Indian feel in your work? There's no Indianness. And we were already post-independence, rather I would put it in the context of post-colonial. So there was an identity which had to be established from the margins of the third world to react creatively into internationalism as it was called then. So Panikkar came back with this remark and he introspected. He says, yes, there has to be. And he had observed the modern arena within the nation itself, and he felt that most of the modern art that was produced in India after independence was a sterile version of most of the European art. He had already explored agenda paintings. Then he became aware of Jamni Roy's experiments with the folk tradition, which he had derived from his hometown of Bankura. And when he looked at that, then he decided that why not archaeologize his own native traditions. So that is how, he developed this attitude towards tradition, pushing his students to look at their own culture and then, turn it around, use it as a trope, and according to the contemporary sensibility. And this was to mark a great advance in modern art in Chennai. And also one thing one must remember is that Madras College of Arts and Crafts is the only institution in the south. And so all the students aspiring to be artists, they gravitated towards this institution. So Panikkar that way played a very seminal role, a very dominant role. It was in a sense easy for him also because he was also a theorist, a visionary, a very good administrator, and of course, a dynamic painter who had already shown that what he could do with his works. So he had a core group of students around him with whom he debated, discussed, argued. And they all, confronted these questions of what modern in India was like. And they felt that if they can go back to their culture and derive their ideas from there. That is why Panikkar kept saying that tradition is a deathless storehouse. It's a storehouse of deathless creative energies. So Panikkar, that way, in his art, it was very difficult for him to survive with what he was doing because nobody could understand. But he was able to create this a sense of modernity with the regional tradition. So what was started by DP was in a different way continued by Panikkar. And after Panikkar, most of the artists had established themselves. That is why Cholamandal Artist Village has played such a dominant role.
You want to hold Cholamandal thought for a little later?
Okay, fine.
I'll come back to that.
So yeah, that's why. So Panikkar's role was very difficult. No support from the critics. There was only one critic, James Cousin, who wrote for the Mail paper, which was published in the evening, and he wrote only on Indian art and handicrafts. Unlike Bombay. Should I mention Bombay?
Yes, of course. But we'll come back to that because
So
some of the things you said, I think, will really lead on to, because I want to open up this question of tradition.
Yeah.
So let me just build forward from what Ashrafi has just. It's been a deep plunge into both the philosophy and the ideology of the Madras movement. And I want to take that trope of tradition as a deathless storehouse of ideas, of experience, of values, and come to you, Namita, because I'm skating out on thin ice. But Bharatanatyam, which is often seen as a timeless classical form, was, if you look at it, if you historicize it, it was essentially invented as part of the national, don't kill me, as part of a nationalist upsurge and a kind of reimagining of classical sources, if you will. And it built on, I'm hoping you'll flesh out this account and engage with it as a practitioner. It was built out of Sadir. It worked across certain entrenched social asymmetries. It also perhaps involved a certain degree of, it was a very peculiar tension between a puritanism towards where the dance came from and a sense of openness to what it could do as an expression of a nascent nation, or the idea of a nation. So could you maybe draw out for us, through your own practice, how you negotiate some of these questions that Ashrafi has been dealing with? Questions of what one looks back to tradition for, or is tradition a special form of modernity? I mean, in what way does tradition come back to life or remain a resource for, particularly the work you're doing as a dancer?
The dance form that I practice, as everybody knows, is an ancient dance form. Like you said, Sadir, it had many other names too. Dasyatam. It began in the precincts of the temples. So the nature was always, it definitely wasn't modern, okay, when it was practiced back then. So it always began in the precincts of the temple, and it always talked about the religious, scriptures, the epics, and so on. So it moved to modernism much, much later. But like we all know, that every art form keeps changing every few years. So what happened was, it was dying a slow death in the early, let's say, 19th century. And we all know the history, I guess most people know about what happened, and it was the Devdasi system was banned, and along with it was banned the practice by the Devdasis. They were the practitioners. And also the great Natya Acharyas, that is their teachers, the gurus, who belonged, they had a lineage, like my gurus are the 7th generation of Nattavanars or Natya Acharyas, gurus. So suddenly they realized that there was no patronage and they didn't know where to go. So there were different kinds of dancers. There were the court dancers. There were the Devdasis who danced in the temples. And there were also dancers who danced probably at religious functions and ceremonies and stuff like that. So suddenly they realized there was no work for them. What do they do in those circumstances? How do they survive? So there was a challenge, but it was in the 1930s that E. Krishna Iyer and of course the great Rukmini Devi Arundel, who decided to revive the dance form. So now in this case, it's just the opposite. It was full of traditional ideas, values, scriptures and everything that was so traditional. And now they had to think of some way to make it appealing. And since it was performed only by a certain class of people, okay, certain professional people only, they decided to bring it, to the regular audience. So there were people from the upper strata of society in Chennai, in Madras. They started practicing this dance form, thanks to again Rukmini Devi Arundel and Krishna Iyer. So what happened in the process was they had to modify the dance form. So to modify, there were a lot of changes, like, for example, the Devdasis would talk about or dance to lyrics which were probably not inappropriate. They were probably inappropriate, when it came to the upper strata of, especially the children learning these dance forms. Because suddenly there were school-going girls who were learning these dance forms. So they had to, change the topics, the themes, stuff like that. The lyrics changed, so it became more devotional in nature. So the erotic suddenly moved and it became devotional. So it had probably the need of the hour. So it had to be done. But of course they were accused for Brahmanizing the art form. there were people like Bala Saraswati who decided they were going to retain the traditionalism and were going to stick to that no matter what. So, they were parallel, of course. They were the two kinds of teachers. They ran parallel, but it went on. It's not that, one disturbed the other. So, the art form changed completely, but here was a challenge now to the dancers, like how do you present these dance forms in their true structured format? At the same time, present something new. So those were the challenges. And that's the reason why dancers started looking around what's happening, the contemporary scene, the politics and all that. And today, of course, it has evolved to such a great extent that we have pieces of Shakespeare done in Bharatanatyam, and so on. So I hope I've, somewhere near.
No, thank you very much for addressing this complex history and also not shying away from precisely the accusation often made that there was a powerful Brahmanizing and a turning away from the more erotic aspects of the form to the playing up of bhakti.
Right.
But also what I want to take with me as I go to Siddharth is this question of ultimately who is a form for, questions of audience or of reception. And you've already indicated adroitly the fact that there were simultaneously several kinds of audiences. Those used to the more traditional, if you will, more, I'm using the word cautiously, erotic exposition, and those who were relatively more Puritan, but also more involved with kind of nationalist dream of a new nation, if you will. But I'm going to ask Siddharth, I'm going to draw you into this conversation with this kind of question, Siddharth. As a practitioner of the culinary arts, on the one hand, your own approach is transcultural, it's contemporary. I mean, contemporary becomes a slightly meaningless word unless you look at what's going into it. And I would imagine from your kind of perspective, it's a global transcultural approach. But when you actually look at the materiality of your art, the ingredients, the practices, the traditions that you might draw on, how does that play out for you? And how might you think of bringing in what could be called a regional cuisine and translating that for your intended, I don't know if audience is the right word, your particular constituency? Could I draw you out on some of these questions?
So addressing that, I'd just like to take a slight step back and see how we've reached where we are today. So when we had the British Raj happening over here, we had the Madras presidency and we had the Bombay presidency, they did not really care about what the locals ate. There was no restaurants in India that were really propagated. There were the gymkhanas, there were the clubs, and that's where only the Britishers were allowed. There were no Indians allowed in there. So when partition happened, you suddenly had a whole bunch of immigrants who had lost their jobs, lost their livelihood, and some of them decided to dwell into the restaurant industry. And that's how we have it today. So even before the British came, before the Dutch came, before the French came, we had tremendous amounts of things that were brought to India. Chili is not something that exists over here. Like we used to spice our food with pepper. And now we have the chilies that came in from the New World, that came into Europe and then came into India. So when you look at it as a regional cuisine, we've lost a lot of it after partition, so it becomes very difficult. But since we're such a rich agricultural land, there's a lot of things that grow here and grow fantastically well. So in terms of representing that to my audience is a bit of a challenge, because when you try to be as authentic as possible, you tend to lose your path in that sense. And with the way things are moving, the way the customer is demanding what he's looking for today, he's no longer looking for what was available 50 years ago. He's not looking for those typical Punjabi dishes that became nationalized in a sense. So I hope I helped you as far as, okay.
But also if you could address this, I mean, I'm beginning to warm to this idea of how you might translate some of these things. Of course, your customers might not want exactly what people ate 50 years ago, but there's a way in which what people ate 50 years ago is also a function of our imagination. In what ways might you think of experimenting with something that exists in some regional cuisine, and how might that be presented afresh? I mean, is that a challenge that you enjoy?
Most definitely
yeah, because that's some of the drama of what happens in the art around us is precisely that. Elements from a past or pasts which are then brought into
Right.
the artist's presence. So how might that work for you?
So keeping in mind with just observing this room and the display that's on board, it's happening with the plate as well. It's no longer just a handi being presented to you, it's split by every diner. It's individual portions that are coming into the Indian palette as well, where literally your plate looks like a work of art and you do not want to touch it, you don't want to mess around with it. And that becomes a big challenge because when the institutions of education that we receive, even here or abroad, we haven't caught up to that yet. So chefs are left for them to experiment, for them to get out there and use their imagination and progress as far as that is concerned. We're still taught the classics. And that becomes a bit of a challenge because we are taught in a particular fashion and we're asked to go out there with no discipline or no direction and said, feel free, do what you like. And that's not always widely accepted as well. So I see a lot of similarities with art and the culinary sphere kind of blending together at this point where the presentation is key. People will not touch it if it does not look beautiful on a plate.
Thank you for those, for drawing us into some of the secrets of your art. But Kamalika, I'm going to turn back to you with that current of thought. Notions of how one is trained in the classics, or for instance, in your discipline, or in the way architecture is viewed, particularly conservation. People arrive with fixed notions such as Indo-Saracenic or Art Deco. And again, it sounds like this is something that fell from heaven or from Canaan from the West. But the fact is that there's no, Indo-Saracenic, for instance, refers to things that are related by a family resemblance. Art Deco is not the same in Bombay as it is in Jaipur, as it is in Chennai. So could I draw you out on that? Because we're also really discussing here the specific nature of modernity in a city. So how does that play out for you when you engage with these questions, particularly when you're working on conservation projects?
Right. So for me, actually, this slice of time is very interesting, which is the turn of the 20th century. So we kind of look at 1905, 1910, till about independence, so let's say 1950. The 40 years has seen so much of a churn and what has emerged and what we see in our contemporary buildscape today and understand as historic architecture versus the 19th century, which was like a slower time. Our cities have kind of seen 100 years of classicism or 100 years of Edwardian, 50 years of Edwardian Baroque. And then suddenly at the turn of the century, in about 40 years or 50 years, we see an effusion of different styles. And sometimes we as, for ease, for us to kind of break it up rationally and logically and be able to theorize on it, like to compartmentalize them that this was the era of Indo-Saracenic or this was an era of, and date things because that's how historians and conservationists like to work. But the moment we begin to look at them almost as parallel processes, because if Indo-Saracenic was in the early 20th century, by the time that transitions into Art Deco in the 30s, we already have an awakened sense of the freedom struggle and the idea of the nation. So we see the revivalist style as well in our cities. So these are actually parallel processes which are leading us to the modernism as we understand with Corbusier and the international style. So now if I have to break up each style, yes, we can do it, and there are lots of books and other research which exists, but we'll also have to see how they became Indian. Therefore, we have this phrase of the Indo-Deco or Cinema Deco, because these are forms of Art Deco which were localized with forms, with aesthetics. So the way the cinemas and the theaters, the single screen theaters adopted Art Deco were, I would say, still purer to the foreign influence than if you see public buildings. And I think the New India Assurance building really stands out in that sense with the kind of motifs that it was trying to capture in iconography, in ornamentation. So, and different cities have appropriated the style in their own way. If I just look at, say Madras, for example, the example of those who are familiar with the De Angelis Hotel on Mount Road. It was built in 1908, and it was actually modeled on, if you see old photographs, on the Watsons Hotel. In fact, it was known as the Watsons of the East because of the cast iron facade, etc. But that was 1908. By the 1930s, the same hotel was remodeled with an Art Deco facade. So we're also talking about transformations and mutations that the same edifice takes. It's almost like masks and personas with changing time, changing tastes, and changing patronage.
Thank you. Those were very precise words, which I'm now going to take to Ashrafi. Specifically, as one walks through this exhibition, we also have a strong sense of how various members of this broad grouping, which is also intergenerational, for instance, Nandagopal is right here, right across from us. It's not like it was a school or a movement that was unified in its stylistic choices. You might, for instance, have right behind us Sultan Ali, who reached out to a certain notion of festivity, but it was through a symbolic vocabulary that he developed. You could have Panikkar himself, as you said in your opening remarks, who looked back to scripture, the tantras, but also drawing on notions of the code and the cipher, which were modern. And then there was the entire turn in this movement towards reclaiming a more traditional, a vibrantly traditional notion of sculpture, a particular kind of sculpture that confronted you, that had reference to the world of the icon and the sacred. And then, of course, there are the Parisians. There's Vishwanathan on the upper floor, and Vasudev, Akitam Vasudevan, who also went off in a completely different direction. Also in terms of, for instance, Vishwanathan's use of casein, the material choices were also different. So could I draw you out on this aspect of the Madras? I mean, our tendency is usually to wrap things up and say, well, the Bombay school, the Baroda school, the heterogeneity of it. So could you maybe parse that for us in terms of how that evolved, in terms of where people went, what things outside of Madras they encountered, and the artistic choices they made?
If you have to look at it that way, there is a heterogeneity, yes, but there's also a commonality, a thread of commonality which binds all of them together. The beauty of the Madras modern is that each artist perceived tradition in their own way, in a very individualistic way. And what is important to remember is that they all came from such backgrounds. So if you are looking at Haridasan's works, who was actually a pioneer of neo-tantric movement in the south, he came from a family which practiced tantric cult. So he watched his father performing this Dhuli Chitra, which is, it's a very ephemeral art. And then once the puja is over, the mantras have been chanted, then it is removed from the surface of the Mother Earth. Same thing with also Vishwanathan. He also came from a family of that sort. Then when we look at Akitam Vasudev, you mentioned Akitam Vasudev. Akitam Vasudev started very figuratively, and then when he went to Paris, he wanted to have his roots intact, to maintain his identity. That's what even Vishwanathan did. So that's what exactly Raza did. So the roots were very important for them, for their identity. So tradition played a very important role. Then if you are looking at S.G. Vasudev, now Vasudev was not inspired so much by the folk tradition or the visual art tradition, but he was inspired by literature. D.K. Bendre and Ramanujam. From Ramanujam, he drew out the motif of the vriksha. And that vriksha, became his metaphor of life and death, everything put together. Then if you're looking at Redappa Naidu. Redappa Naidu was inspired by Tirupati's Balaji. It was his Muslim friend who actually pointed out to him and says, you are looking for a personal language, You have it in front of you in this very abstract concept of Balaji. So he worked on the deities, sans the sacredness, the sanctity of it. And he created the deity series, which was one of Kali especially, and then later on of Ganesha. Then if you have to look at Sultan Ali. Now Sultan Ali had a very itinerant career. In the sense, he passed out, he graduated in 1944. Then he worked for some time, he did some courses in photography and textiles, etc. Then he took up a job at Madanapalli, the school of K. Krishnamurti school, J. Krishnamurti school. There he came across the tribals Lambadis, and that aroused his interest. In the meantime, he had already got a job at Lalit Kala in Delhi in 1954 or 55. So he joined there as an exhibition officer. As an exhibition officer, he was traveling and he came to Gujarat and he saw the tribal art of Gujarat there. But earlier in 1950, he had read a book of Verrier Elwin, who was a British anthropologist who had written on the tribal arts in India. So that aroused his interest, which was reinforced by his experiences of traveling to Gujarat, as well as already his earlier experiences of encountering the Lambadis. When he looked at the tribal art, he said it's not just a tribal art that he is representing, but he created a metaphor of energy. That's why the bull, that's why the snake, which is so dominant in his works. And if you look at his figurative language, you see a distortion where, the forms are distorted, but the tribal heads are there. Of course, Panikkar was inspired by kolam, folk deities, astrological horoscopes. All of these things inspired him, Malayalam script, English script, etc. Then if you have to look at Gopinath, he was an abstractionist. He was inspired completely in a different way by just one sculpture of Nataraja. He says Nataraja has that prabhavali or that aureole around it. He says remove that aureole. You cannot, the whole figure loses its value. And that's why you'll find a lot of curved forms in his works. So these are all the various artists who have intelligently perceived, experienced, experimented, explored, and then developed their visual language. So if you can say this, I would like to go back to her question of, not a question, where she mentions revivalism. Revivalism actually became a very important discussing point in the post-independence era. They say, will revivalism also mean reviling the tradition? Because it was already done with the indigenism in the colonial era. So now when it comes back to the 60s, it's taken a full circle. But then in the South, it has always been insulated. So when this idea of regional tradition coming back with a new perspective, it was practiced by all the artists because they came from such backgrounds carrying their cultural baggage. They all came from rural backgrounds. Most of them came from rural backgrounds. So what Panikkar was trying to put forth, they were able to relate with him very easily. It was not something, like a, rocket science that they had to really think about or explore. It was part of their life. It was part of their, bringing up. It was part of their culture. So that is how they were able to bring forth. And that is why Panikkar was able to push his agenda of nativism so easily. But what you see here are the artists who actually explored very intelligently. I call them all as intellectuals because each one has explored a different trajectory.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to now ask you what it means as a dancer to take away the aureole around Nataraj. Because I wonder if we can take forward this very rich vein of discussion which has to do with, it's been called, the strategy has been parsed in different ways. Sometimes as indigenism, as a so-called return to roots, sometimes as the kind of engagement with the lived experience and practices that you described. and sometimes very broadly as primitivism, which is a very vexed category, but it refers to ways in which visual artists, architects, musicians have gone back to cultures. Hal Foster has a beautiful way of putting it. He says, too often out there means back then. There's a kind of ethnographic gaze that that modernists have brought to resources from other cultures or from other periods. But how would this drama be incarnated for someone like you? Because we've heard here in Ashrafi's account of artists who was within a lived experience, but also necessarily distancing themselves a little to be able to arrive at an idiom that was, so to speak, contemporary. Yeah? And can one ever be contemporary? Obviously, as Agamben asks, how are you going to be in the moment when the moment is already 1 second behind you? But you've turned in recent work to figures from the epics, to Kaikeyi, to Gandhari. So could you talk a little bit about that process?
Artist, while I go through those phases, there are times when I want to only do traditional stuff. So I do something that is called a traditional margam, what Bharatanatyam dancers call a margam, a path. So it begins with a particular piece and ends with a particular piece. In my case, it's Alaripu and ends with a Tillana. So there are times when I don't want to do that. There are times I want to experiment. But like I do the same with my students too. But to begin with, you have to have a strong base. Since it's a structured dance form, we have to understand the structure and then move around it. So it depends on the dexterity of the artist, the choreographer. So what happens is, if I do not understand what a Nataraja is to begin with, how do I experiment with it? I cannot come up with vague ideas if I do not understand the Nataraja, right, in its totality. And then if I want to experiment, it's fine. Because it's a classical dance form, if I move away completely from it, it will no longer remain a Bharatanatyam dance, dance form. It will be something else completely. So how do I do that? How do I bring in, pieces which are not traditional and yet weave it into the grammar of the dance form? So, like you talked about Gandhari and Kaikeyi. So when we started, this was a collaboration, so we started thinking about doing something, picking up two characters from different eras, different yugas. We had to remember that we had to bring in, some kind of a freshness, because it's been performed so many times. We have seen Kaikeyi being done dime a dozen, so many times we have seen that, and the same approach. So our approach was a little different. So my approach to Gandhari was different. So what do we know about Gandhari? What did she do? She was blindfolded, and she was a helpless queen. She couldn't do anything. No, it's fine. She couldn't do anything to stop her sons, thank you so much, from, being those wicked people and the things that they did. So how do I present it? So I started reading a lot, about Gandhari. And I realized that that's not how I want to interpret that character. I think there were different reasons why she put the blindfold. Basically, the idea was not mine, the other collaborator, the other dancer. But I had to work on those lines. So I thought I gave it a different angle completely. And not just because I wanted to make it different. It was after going through all the books and all the poetry and everything that was written about her, I just thought, no, this is not the reason why she put the blindfold. She did that because she wanted to rebel. She did that because she wanted to express her anger, towards the helplessness that was happening around her. And she did not do it willingly. So I took it, completely. I mean, it was not that, I disregarded the facts or whatever, was written in the books, but it was my interpretation to why she did what she did. So this was bringing some kind of a freshness to it. And also, like Bharatanatyam is pretty multilingual, because most people think that we only dance to Tamil lyrics. No, it's not so. It's Kannada, it's Telugu, it's also Hindi, Sanskrit. So the whole thing was done in Sanskrit. But yet, the approach was different. It's the approach that what we are always looking at. So how do we keep the audience interested in this dance form? At the same time, give a touch of, not novelty, a freshness. Because this dance form otherwise tends to get very stagnant, and people in our dance form, classical dance forms, the audience tends to get very bored very easily. Yes, it's true, because you're talking about the same deities, the same songs, the same lyrics, so we have to bring that freshness to it. I hope I've addressed your...
Fabulous. And as you were... this is really at the core of some of the questions we're looking at. How do you revisit a canon on the one hand, and how do you break with it and move to what in some contexts is thought of as an avant-garde, but what you might call freshness, a difference of interpretation, and those thoughts take me directly to Siddharth. As you look at this array of ingredients that arrive from Central and South America, and which we believe to be timelessly Indian, but that's not the question. I would like to explore with you how these concepts, which to some of us seem to be part of the vocabulary of our arts, how do they work with you? As a product of a particular kind of training, a classical training, it's a twofold question. Is there a canon that you work with certain criteria, a certain notion of what are the criteria of value, what is acceptable, what might be contemporary? On the other hand, like many modern and contemporary artists, do you need to engage with an audience through elements of surprise, the unexpected, the unpredictable? And to that extent, is there a part of your practice which also involves, if this isn't too loaded a word, a pedagogy? Right. How do you curate your audience? How do you extend through the culinary arts some form of education to those who come to you? Yeah, so a twofold question. Right. The canon that you work with and how you interpret it for your customers, and how you might engage with them in some kind of dialogue to move them out of their normal expectations.
Correct. That question, that's always an inspiration as well, is to step away from the norm and do something different and refresh people and make them step out of their comfort zone. When we just recently did that with one of the restaurants that we opened lately, and it was a challenge. It was an absolute challenge to say that, hey, this is my vision, this is what I think food should be, and this is the way I want to present it to you. And it took us a really long time to get people to understand what it was that we were trying to do. We were trying to not mask the flavors of a simple vegetable. We wanted to highlight those flavors, like literally as raw, like taste a cauliflower, taste a broccoli. See what those vegetables actually taste like without masking them under spices and things of that sort. And it wasn't well received, to be completely honest with you. And maybe there is a time and place for those things. But it's genuinely not easy. It's one of those things where you take classical things that you're trained with, exactly very similar to what you said with the Natraj thing. You need to understand the classics to be able to innovate and modernize and refresh people with something interesting, again, because it gets very mundane. I resonate a lot because it gets very, very mundane, and you need to add that fresh element to it. Yeah, I think like when you look at the whole trajectory of the way food has moved around the world, the way ingredients have moved around the world, you see something like a masaman curry, right? It's actually another word for Muslim, which was taken all the way to the Southeast Asia, and now you have masaman curry, which is available in Thailand and the Penang region in Malaysia, which is actually just a blend of spices picked up from south of India and then transported over there. You see the transformation, and you try to realize that, okay, how can we make all of this work and introduce it in a nouveau fashion? That's quite interesting as a challenge.
Thank you. Kamalika, what would be your menu for for a conservation architecture course? What would be the key themes or urgencies that you would flag? This is by way of a rapid fire round. If anyone remembers the quizzes are very long.
So this is, you're talking about contemporary? Okay. No, because I was going to link this to, like, because we are talking about, you know, artists, dancers, and like practitioners of the art form. So I was just thinking of what were architects really practicing and contributing in that time, and I'm going to then link that to a contemporary situation. I think, you know, unlike artists who have phases of their work. So if you kind of look at their body of work, you see the evolution and the trajectory. But sometimes architects are actually designing multiple styles, multiple kinds of expressions within, simultaneously, in the same year or in the same 5 years. And I think if I just give a small example of, say, Gregson Batley and his practice, just the breadth of his work, the body of his work, and he was also associated with the JJ School of Art. So again, architecture, sorry. So pedagogy and the kind of architects the school was training, and Betley's work in the same year between 40 and 42, he's built Art Deco bungalows, he's also done Indo-Saracenic work, he's also done classicism. So, you know, and depending on who the patron is, whether it's for the royal family in a princely state versus a mercantile elite from the Sarabhai family in Ahmedabad, you see an Art Deco bungalow. So architecture tends to kind of shift a breakaway a little bit in that sense, because we see practitioners who through their training are able to straddle multiple styles and address the sort of the times in which they are operating. And I think if I just directly link that to today, if we look at conservation education, so to see, we are kind of somewhere, I think, frozen the lens of where we think time should stop if we want to conserve our cities. It's almost like we don't, which is why many times conservations are constantly considered to be anti-development and at loggerheads with anything to do with the future, because they want this city to not grow beyond a point. And which is actually not true, and that should not be the case. And conservation education should be able to weave in this balance between making the past even relevant today, and what are the values that you therefore conserve, rather than just the building type or the aesthetic of the building. And if we are able to integrate that within a course, within the educational framework, I think conservation will be looked at as a partner in cities and their future, and it doesn't have to be just fossilizing, you know, an ossified sense of history and why we're trying to keep certain types of buildings from a nostalgia or from a memory perspective, but how do we really upgrade them? So I think in the West there are some programs which have already begun to look at things like integrated with the green or sustainability, and there's this notion, there's this saying that conservation is the best form of recycling, or the greenest building is one which is already built. So you're already looking at historic cities and historic precincts within this notion of continuity. I think that is a very important strand today, when sustainability, climate change, all of that is very important.
Thank you for bringing in these aspects of temporality and where the core density of a style or a movement or a practice might be, and what its afterlife might well be, because that's what I want to now address to Ashrafi. Because very often when we look back at really the lineage of the modern, or the traditions of modernism as they've evolved through the long 20th century, it sometimes feels as though we're looking at time capsules, at moments rather than movements. And then they have like a trigger release, there's an afterlife, someone rediscovers it, there's some measure of continuity. From that point of view, what would you regard as the the relevance and practice of this particular formation or grouping of artists. We see their historical importance, but are they alive, whether it's through the images or through the impulses or the questions? Are they still valuable to young artists, students of arts, of the visual arts in Madras and its broader hinterland?
I would say no.
Such a pessimist.
No, in the sense that there's no post-Madras art movement. What happened till the 1990s is what was developed, explored, with all the vitality, freshness, spontaneity, intellectuality, all those things put together. But then today, if you have to really look at what is contemporary in Madras, they all have moved on. Moved on in the sense that they are all still the products of the same institution, but none of them are inspired by what has gone before them. Unfortunately, fortunately, whichever way you want to see it. I would say fortunately because imagine, the same thing being, getting cliched and stereotypical. At least there's a new freshness when we think of Madras artists, because they have also become globalized. They are a younger generation, and they have greater exposure through residencies, through workshops, through looking at museums in different parts of the world. So that's the difference it has made. If you say it's a time capsule development, yes, it is very much a time capsule development. It was the contingency, it was the exigencies which demanded such an art, and such an art came into being. So that's what defined it as modernity, and defined it particularly as regional modernity with its roots deep in tradition and its culture. Like Achyutan was very much inspired by the sounds and sights of his village Kudalur. I believe in the middle of the night that exorcism would happen, and there would be sounds and the beating of the drums. And how he translates all those aspects into his visual arts is amazing. Calligraphic lines, shapes, etc. play into his work. So that way, yes, I would say that this is where it is, and nothing more and nothing less.
Thank you for that seemingly melancholy but very candid and lucid account of how one might look at a certain peak moment in artistic production. I'm going to turn to you, Namita, with a similar question, keeping in mind one of the great Greek paradoxes. The Greeks obviously had lots of time on their hands to invent paradoxes, but the one I'm thinking of is the ship of Theseus. Now, if every part of the ship is replaced, by the time it makes landfall, is it the same ship? So could one think of tradition in that way? And whether it's Nataraj with or without the aureole, fresh or reinterpretation. At one point I thought I detected a note of, I'm not going to call it anxiety, but a certain question that you clearly have in your practice, which is how far can I extend myself while still being identifiably a practitioner of Bharatanatyam? Is that an anxiety, or what might be the moment when your experiments take you beyond that corpus? And what kind of moment would that be for you in your practice?
Well, it happens very often. There's always that, we are doubting ourselves, there's that self-doubting, and we're always wondering, whether we are moving out of our zone, the structured pattern, and how much should we move away from that. So will it remain a ship, or it'll be something else completely? So something like that. So it happens all the time. Let me be frank. So there was this time when I wanted to experiment with something, with some jazz music. And it happened at Kala Ghoda. This was about, I think, more than 10 years ago. And I heard the music, and I just loved it. And as an artist, I wanted to interpret. I wanted to do something with it. And I wanted to express myself in the art form that I know the best. And I started, and the only movements that I know are those of Bharatanatyam, nothing besides that. So I started, I just put the music on and I started moving. And there was something definite happening. And I thought, why not? So it was a beautiful piece, and I performed it several times along with my students. But I was highly criticized for that. Oh my God. And the Puritans, they were very, very skeptical. And I received an email that said, how dare you call it Bharatajasyam, because that's what I called it. How dare Bharatanatyam and jazz? Sacrilege. And I received that email and I answered respectfully, because this was some senior artist who said that. And I said, do you know the origin of jazz? You know, it began from the anguish of the blacks. And it's so beautiful. What is wrong with that? And what is Bharatanatyam? Why can't we bring them together? These are the lyrics. There is some music which is a little different, but I can see Bharatanatyam in it. So why not? So that dancer was a little bit apologetic. But later, I mean, I found out that, I mean, because of that particular email, of course, more and more people got interested in Bharatajasyam, and I was requested to, so I got a lot of good publicity from it. So that's what's been happening to me. Every few years, I keep questioning my art form, you know, and should I or not step out? And I always want to step out a little bit.
Siddharth, as the last question in this first move of this evening, I'm going to turn to you with a similar reflection on what might boundary conditions mean if your practice is completely premised on experiment. You know, where do you set your boundaries? Are there boundaries? Are they laid down by a community of practice, colleagues? Do you face the kinds of questions that Namita has faced? Would be one fold of the question. But I'd also want to draw you out on how you might, not that I'm a fan of labels, but the minute one is in some kind of hybrid or I mean hybrid is a good word here, hybrid, intermediate, transcultural space, there's been historically a desire to name that space. Very inadequate labels sometimes in music and dance, as in cuisine, global or fusion, sometimes global fusion, terms that actually refer to nothing much except a vagueness. So how would you approach your practice? Is there a desire to name it? So two questions. One is the boundary conditions, if any, and how would you define the ground of your practice?
So there's several times where you get that urge to just be like, let's take everything that I've learned so far. Let's just imagine I was the first human on the planet, and how am I going to start from this? I have a blank canvas, let's get started. So a couple of things, that just to give you an example, you typically cook scrambled eggs on a pan with some oil. You'd crack the eggs, whisk it together. But let's imagine a situation where I decided to boil a pot of water, and then I decided to spin that water, and in the spinning water, I decided to drop my whisked egg. And then all of a sudden, I'm not losing moisture from the egg, I'm adding more moisture into it, and it's still scrambling at the same time because the water is spinning around. All of a sudden, you get scrambled eggs, which are completely different from where you've cooked them before. So when you actually take that step back and be like, let's just forget the way I know it, and then things kind of open up. But it's really not easy. You really got to, I think, for me personally, you have to spend a lot of time to think that way. So you generally just tend to stay more classical. Hey, switch on the flame, put the pan on, let's get started. You know, that kind of situation. But when it comes to naming, I think there is that, since food is such a carnal urge, there is always that aspect of you're seeking individuality, right? So one of the concepts, just to give an example of what we came up with the previous restaurant, was we called it upscale comfort food. So again, trying to separate yourself, because people like that narrative, they like that story, they want to feel engaged in that process. And that's when you decide to coin it. But things like global and fusion,
Well, thank you all so much, and I'm going to open this up to our colleagues here for questions.
Were you ever questioned, like you spoke about combining Bharatanatyam and jazz, were you questioned why you didn't combine something else?
Sorry, why I didn't?
Maybe combine it with something else.
No, like it began by listening to that music. So, that's how it began. So I heard that particular piece, which was actually, it had strains of Carnatic music in it, by this beautiful, I don't know whether you've heard of Prem Joshua. I think you have, right? So yes, exactly. So it was that music that inspired me, and that's why I moved towards that. But there are times when I'm experimenting with something else completely different. Like I recently did a poem, why am I forgetting? Still I Rise by Maya Angelou. Okay, so yeah, it could be I hope I've answered that question, or is that what you were?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, a question there.
My question goes to Namita ma'am. Your story of combining Bharatanatyam and jazz reminded me of Chandralekha, because she had also taken the base of Bharatanatyam as a dance and then combined it with other forms such as Kalaripayattu and martial art forms, and even used that dance to train women, to empower women in the rural areas in Tamil Nadu, and this also happened at the time of nationalist movement. So, and she pretty much faced the backlash which you did today. So what would you say to the future Bharatanatyam dancers who would want to try something contemporary or infuse it with something else?
I always tell my students, understand the basics first. Understand, so you have to go through the 7 years, minimum 7 years of understanding what Bharatanatyam is. It is only after you practice for a couple of years that you'll be able to experiment if there is a need, okay? If there's an urge to experiment. But you have to, like you said about Chandralekha, okay? So it was only much later that, I don't know whether I'm still accepted or not that I care, but what happened is, it was, when you're an upcoming artist, when you hear those things, it can be very demoralizing. And it's like if you tell them, and that's exactly what I told a lot of people. Don't you know these great artists? I named few, one of them being Chandralekha ji. So I said, they have experimented too. Oh, it's different. They are all senior artists. Okay, so it took a while. Because, what has happened is also, there's so much of, these terms like fusion. Every second person is doing fusion. So, I hate that word. Because it is corrupted. It's corrupted. So, this is the reason why I always say you understand the dance form, the art form that you're practicing, and then later, you will definitely be able to, and the challenges, yes, of course. So to the future dancers, don't get scared easily. That's it, You will have your anxieties and all that, but just keep at it. Thanks.
I got you before you were about to summarize, sorry. I said I got you before you were about to wrap it up. One last question. First of all, thank you so much for such an insightful conversation. I hope everyone's enjoyed it and learned as much as I have. I have one question. Perhaps coming to Indian art slightly from outside, there seems to be, in modern Indian art, a very regional approach. You have Bombay progressives, Madras art movement, Baroda, Bengal school, etc., etc. My question is, how much do you think this regional approach has helped or hindered in telling the story of Indian modernism?
Who are you directing this to?
Anybody who feels they have an answer.
Why don't we I think it's been useful at least partly because it marks the location where certain moments or movements began, as we were saying earlier. But in the long run, I think it's probably prevented us from looking at A, the transcultural connections that Indian artists have always had, and B, I think it's ensured that certain figures who didn't fit into that particular city-centered, place-centered kind of narrative, they just vanished. And the resurrection in some cases has taken decades. I mean, this is a particular pet peeve of mine because I've been associated with his work for such a long time. Mohan Samant, for instance. He was someone who broke away from the so-called Bombay progressives. Steered his own path in New York, was very much his own man. I've described him somewhere as a one-man avant-garde. And there was no place for him in an art history that was written in this way, because he didn't fit. So it's a combination of time, place, and ideology. But I think our art history has suffered from that point of view. And in some sense, I think it was important for many decades to map out an art history that was territorial, that was nation-based. It was linked to a narrative about a new nation-state. But as I say, I think it's really prevented us from looking at many rich dimensions of individual practices. So that's my response to this. It's useful shorthand. In some cases, as in this exhibition, it refers to a very strong commitment to locality, but locality that's already inscribed with multiple heterogeneous energies, as we've talked about. But in some cases, it's unhelpful. Yeah. I'm not going to make myself popular, but the Bombay progressives, for instance, it's a meaningless label in large measure. And it does very little justice to the careers of these artists as they moved beyond that moment in the late 40s and early 50s.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for this wonderful panel discussion. You know, when we were putting this together, and I was thinking to myself, you're comparing Madras and Bombay through food, through dance, through art and architecture, and I'm thinking, okay, which is something that we are very passionate about at Avid. We look at the city of Bombay, and we are now into the 43rd edition that we're going to have, all sports in the city, next month. But I think this was such an interesting way of comparing two cities to pay homage to this wonderful exhibition curated by Dr. Bhagat. Thank you, audience, for being here. The curator will take you for a short walkthrough in a bit, so I hope you do stay back and have a wonderful evening. Thank you, panel, once again.
Thank you.